Chapter 17. The Chessboard Fields. Below the villa, between the line of hills on which it stood and the sea, were the chessboard fields. The sea curved into the coast in a great, almost landlocked bay, shallow and bright, and on the flat land along its edges lay the intricate pattern of narrow waterways that had once been salt pans in the Venetian days. Each neat little patch of earth, framed with canals, was richly cultivated and green, with crops of maize, potatoes, figs, and grapes. These fields, small coloured squares edged with shining waters, lay like a sprawling multicoloured chessboard on which the peasants' coloured figures moved from place to place. This was one of my favourite areas for hunting in, for the tiny waterways and the lush undergrowth harboured a multitude of creatures. It was easy to get lost there, for if you were enthusiastically chasing a butterfly and crossed the wrong little wooden bridge from one island to the next, you could find yourself wandering to and fro, trying to get your bearings in a bewildering maze of fig trees, reeds, and curtains of tall maize. Most of the fields belonged to friends of mine, peasant families who lived up in the hills. So when I was walking there, I was always sure of being able to rest and gossip over a bunch of grapes with some acquaintance, or to receive interesting items of news, such as the fact that there was a lark's nest under the melon plants on Giorgio's land. If you walked straight across the chessboard without being distracted by friends, sidetracked by terrapins sliding down the mud banks and plopping into the water, or the sudden crackling buzz of a dragonfly swooping past, you eventually came to the spot where all the channels widened and vanished into a great flat acreage of sand, moulded into endless neat pleats by the previous night's tides. Here, long winding chains of flotsam marked the sea's slow retreat, fascinating chains full of coloured seaweed, dead pipefish, fishing net corks that looked good enough to eat, like lumps of rich fruitcake, bits of bottle glass, emeриed and carved into translucent jewels by the tide and sand, shells as spiky as hedgehogs, others smooth, oval, and delicate pink like the fingernails of some drowned goddess. This was the seabirds' country. Snipe, oystercatcher, dunlin, and terns, strewn in small pattering groups at the edge of the sea, where the long ripples ran toward the land and broke in long curving ruffs round the little humps of sand. Here, if you felt hungry, you could wade out into the shallows and catch fat, transparent shrimps that tasted as sweet as grapes when eaten raw. Or you could dig down with your toes until you found the ribbed nut-like cockles. Two of these, placed end to end, hinge to hinge, and then twisted sharply in opposite directions, opened each other neatly. The contents, though slightly rubbery, were milky and delicious to eat. One afternoon, having nothing better to do, I decided to take the dogs and visit the fields. I would make yet another attempt to catch old Plop, cut across to the sea for a feed of cockles and a swim, and make my way home via Petro's land so that I could sit and exchange gossip with him over a watermelon or a few plump pomegranates. Old Plop was a large and ancient terrapin that lived in one of the canals. I had been trying to capture him for a month or more, but in spite of his age, he was very wily and quick, and no matter how cautiously I stalked him when he lay asleep on the muddy bank, he would always wake up at the crucial moment. His legs would flail frantically, and he would slide down the mud slope and plop into the water like a corpulent lifeboat being launched. I had caught a great many terrapins, of course, both the black ones with the thick freckling of golden pinhead spots on them, and the slim grey ones with fawny green lines. But old Plop was something I had set my heart on. He was bigger than any terrapin I had seen, and so old that his battered shell and wrinkled skin had become completely black, losing any markings that they may have had in his distant youth. I was determined to possess him, and as I had left him alone for a whole week, I thought it was high time to launch another attack. With my bag of bottles and boxes, my net, and a basket to put old Plop in should I catch him, I set off down the hill with the dogs. The magpies called "Gerry! Gerry! Gerry!" after me, in tones of agonized entreaty, and then, finding I did not turn, they fell to jeering and cackling and making rude noises. Their harsh voices faded as we entered the olive groves, and were then obliterated by the choir of cicadas whose song made the air tremble. We made our way along the road, hot, white, and as soft as a powder puff underfoot. I paused at Yanni's well for a drink, and then leant over the rough sty made from olive branches in which the 2 pigs lived, wallowing with sonorous content in a sea of glutinous mud. Having sniffed deeply and appreciatively at them, and slapped the largest on his grubby, quivering behind, I continued down the road. At the next bend, I had a brief argument with 2 fat peasant ladies balancing baskets of fruit on their heads, who were wildly indignant at Whittle. He had crept up on them when they were engrossed in conversation, and after sniffing at them, had lived up to his name over their skirts and legs. The argument as to whose fault it was kept all of us happily occupied for 10 minutes, and was then continued as I walked on down the road, until we were separated by such a distance that we could no longer hear and appreciate each other's insults. Cutting across the first 3 fields, I paused for a moment in Tacky's patch to sample his grapes. He wasn't there, but I knew he wouldn't mind. The grapes were the small, fat variety, with a sweet, musky flavour. When you squeezed them, the entire contents, soft and seedless, shot into your mouth, leaving the flaccid skin between your finger and thumb. The dogs and I ate 4 bunches, and I put another 2 bunches in my collecting bag for future reference, after which we followed the edge of the canal towards the place where Old Plop had his favourite mudslide. As we were drawing near to this spot, I was just about to caution the dogs on the need for absolute silence, when a large green lizard flashed out of a corn patch and scuttled away. The dogs, barking wildly, galloped in eager pursuit. By the time I reached Old Plop's mudslide, there was only a series of gently expanding ripples on the water to tell me that he had been present. I sat down and waited for the dogs to rejoin me, running through in my mind the rich and colourful insults with which I would bombard them. But to my surprise, they did not come back. Their yelping in the distance died away. There was a pause, and then they started to bark in a chorus, monotonous, evenly spaced barks that meant they'd found something. Wondering what it could be, I hurried after them. They were clustered in a half circle around a clump of grass at the water's edge, and came gambolling to meet me, tails thrashing, whining with excitement, Roger lifting his upper lip in a pleased grin that I had come to examine their find. At first, I could not see what it was they were so excited over. Then, what I had taken to be a rootlet moved, and I was looking at a pair of fat, brown water snakes, coiled passionately together in the grass, regarding me with impersonal silvery eyes from their spade-shaped heads. This was a thrilling find, and one that almost compensated for the loss of Old Plop. I had long wanted to catch one of these snakes, but they were such fast and skilful swimmers that I had never succeeded in getting close enough to accomplish a capture. Now the dogs had found this fine pair lying in the sun, there for the taking, as it were. The dogs, having done their duty by finding these creatures and leading me to them, now retreated to a safe distance, for they did not trust reptiles, and sat watching me interestedly. Slowly I manoeuvred my butterfly net round until I could unscrew the handle. Having done this, I had a stick with which to do the catching, but the problem was how to catch 2 snakes with 1 stick. While I was working this out, one of them decided the thing for me, uncoiling himself unhurriedly and sliding into the water as cleanly as a knife blade. Thinking that I had lost him, I watched irritably as his undulating length merged with the water reflection. Then, to my delight, I saw a column of mud rise slowly through the water and expand like a rose on the surface. The reptile had buried himself at the bottom, and I knew he would stay there until he thought I'd gone. I turned my attention to his mate. Pressing her down in the lush grass with the stick, she twisted herself into a complicated knot and, opening her pink mouth, hissed at me. I grabbed her firmly round the neck between finger and thumb, and she hung limp in my hand while I stroked her handsome white belly and the brown back where the scales were raised slightly like the surface of a fire cone. I put her tenderly into the basket and then prepared to capture the other one. I walked a little way down the bank and stuck the handle of the net into the canal to test the depth, and discovered that about 2 feet of water lay on a 3-foot bed of soft, quivering mud. Since the water was opaque, and the snake was buried in the bottom slush, I thought the simplest method would be to feel for him with my toes, as I did when searching for cockles, and having located him, to make a quick pounce. I took off my sandals and lowered myself into the warm water, feeling the liquid mud squeeze between my toes and stroke up my legs as soft as ashes. 2 great black clouds bloomed about my thighs and drifted across the channel. I made my way towards the spot where my quarry lay hidden, moving my feet slowly and carefully in the shifting curtain of mud. Suddenly, under my foot, I felt the slithering body, and I plunged my arms elbow deep into the water and grabbed. My fingers closed only on mud, which oozed between them and drifted away in turbulent, slow-motion clouds. I was just cursing my ill luck when the snake shot to the surface a yard away from me and started to swim sinuously along the surface. With a yell of triumph, I flung myself full length on top of him. There was a confused moment as I sank beneath the dark waters and the silt boiled up into my eyes, ears, and mouth, but I could feel the reptile's body thrashing wildly to and fro, firmly clasped in my left hand, and I glowed with triumph. Gasping and spluttering under my layer of mud, I sat up in the canal and grabbed the snake around the neck before he could recover his wits and bite me. Then I spat for a long time, to rid my teeth and lips of the fine, gritty layer which coated them. When I at last rose to my feet and turned to wade ashore, I found to my surprise that my audience of dogs had been enlarged by the silent arrival of a man, who was squatting comfortably on his haunches and watching me with a mixture of interest and amusement. He was a short, stocky individual, whose brown face was topped by a thatch of close-cropped fair hair the colour of tobacco. He had large, very blue eyes that had a pleasant, humorous twinkle in them, and crow's feet in the fine skin at the corners. A short, hawk's beak nose curved over a wide and humorous mouth. He was wearing a blue cotton shirt that was bleached and faded to the colour of a forget-me-not dried by the sun, and old grey flannel trousers. I did not recognise him, and supposed him to be a fisherman from some village farther down the coast. He regarded me gravely as I scrambled up the bank, and then smiled. "Your health?" he said, in a rich, deep voice. I returned his greeting politely, and then busied myself with the job of trying to get the second snake into the basket without letting the first one escape. I expected him to deliver a lecture to me on the deadliness of the harmless water snakes and the dangers I ran by handling them, but to my surprise, he remained silent, watching with interest while I pushed the writhing reptile into the basket. This done, I washed my hands and produced the grapes I had filched from Tacky's fields. The man accepted half the fruit, and we sat without talking, sucking the pulp from the grapes with noisy enjoyment. When the last skin had plopped into the canal, the man produced tobacco and rolled a cigarette between his blunt brown fingers. "You are a stranger?" he asked, inhaling deeply and with immense satisfaction. I said that I was English, and that I and my family lived in a villa up in the hills. Then I waited for the inevitable questions as to the sex, number, and age of my family, their work and aspirations, followed by a skilful cross-examination as to why we lived in Corfu. This was the usual peasant way. It was not done unpleasantly, nor with any motive other than friendly interest. They would vouchsafe their own private business to you with great simplicity and frankness, and would be hurt if you did not do the same. But, to my surprise, the man seemed satisfied with my answer and asked nothing further, but sat there blowing fine streamers of smoke into the sky and staring about him with dreamy blue eyes. With my fingernail, I scraped an attractive pattern in the hardening carapace of grey mud on my thigh, and decided that I would have to go down to the sea and wash myself and my clothes before returning home. I got to my feet and shouldered my bag and nets. The dogs got to their feet, shook themselves, and yawned. More out of politeness than anything, I asked the man where he was going. It was, after all, peasant etiquette to ask questions. It showed your interest in the person. So far, I hadn't asked him anything at all. "I'm going down to the sea," he said, gesturing with his cigarette. "Down to my boat. Where are you going?" I said I was making for the sea too, first to wash, and secondly to find some cockles to eat. I will walk with you, he said, rising and stretching. I have a basket full of cockles in my boat. You may have some of those if you like. We walked through the fields in silence, and when we had come out on the sands, he pointed at the distant shape of a rowing boat lying comfortably on her side, with a frilly skirt of ripples around her stern. As we walked towards her, I asked if he was a fisherman, and if so, where he came from. I come from here, from the hills, he replied. At least, my home is here, but I am now at Vido. The reply puzzled me, for Vido was a tiny islet lying off the town of Corfu, and as far as I knew it, it had no one on it at all except convicts and warders, for it was the local prison island. I pointed this out to him. That's right, he agreed, stooping to pat Roger as he ambled past. That's right. I am a convict. I thought he was joking and glanced at him sharply, but his expression was quite serious. I said I presumed he had just been let out. No, worse luck, he smiled. I have another 2 years to do. But I am a good prisoner, you see, trustworthy, and make no trouble. Any like me, those they feel they can trust, are allowed to make boats and sail home for the weekend, if it's not too far. I've got to be back there first thing Monday morning. Once the thing was explained, of course, it was simple. It never even occurred to me that the procedure was unusual. I knew one wasn't allowed home for weekends from an English prison, but this was Corfu, and in Corfu, anything could happen. I was bursting with curiosity to know what his crime had been, and I was just phrasing a tactful inquiry in my mind when we reached the boat, and inside it was something that drove all other thoughts from my head. In the stern, tethered to the seat by one yellow leg, sat an immense black-backed gull, who contemplated me with sneering yellow eyes. I stepped forward eagerly and stretched out my hand to the broad, dark back. Be careful, watch out, he's a bully, that one, said the man urgently. His warning came too late, for I had already placed my hand on the bird's back and was gently running my fingers over the silken feathering. The gull crouched, opened his beak slightly, and the dark iris of his eye contracted with surprise, but he was so taken aback by my audacity that he did nothing. Spiridion, said the man in amazement. He must like you. He's never let anyone else touch him without biting. I buried my fingers in the crisp white feathers on the bird's neck, and as I scratched gently, the gull's head drooped forwards, and his yellow eyes became dreamy. I asked the man where he had managed to catch such a magnificent bird. I sailed over to Albania in the spring to try to get some hares, and I found him in a nest. He was small then, and fluffy as a lamb. Now he's like a great duck, the man said, staring pensively at the gull. Fat duck, ugly duck, biting duck, aren't you, eh? The gull, at being thus addressed, opened one eye and gave a short, harsh yarp, which may have been repudiation or agreement. The man leant down and pulled a big basket from under the seat. It was full to the brim with great fat cockles that chinked musically. We sat in the boat and ate the shellfish, and all the time I watched the bird, fascinated by the snow-white breast and head, his long hooked beak and fierce eyes, as yellow as spring crocuses, the broad back and powerful wings, sooty black. From the soles of his great webbed feet to the tip of his beak, he was, in my opinion, quite admirable. I swallowed a final cockle, wiped my hands on the side of the boat, and asked the man if he could get a baby gull for me the following spring. You want one? He said in surprise. You like them? I felt this was understating my feelings. I would have sold my soul for such a gull. Well, have him if you want him, said the man casually, jerking a thumb at the bird. I could hardly believe my ears. For someone to possess such a wonderful creature and to offer him as a gift so carelessly was incredible. Didn't he want the bird? I asked. Yes, I like him, said the man, looking at the bird meditatively. "But he eats more than I can catch for him, and he's such a wicked one that he bites everybody. None of the other prisoners or the warders like him. I've tried letting him go, but he won't go. He keeps coming back. I was going to take him over to Albania one weekend and leave him there, so if you're sure you want him, and you can have him." Sure I wanted him? It was like being offered an angel. A slightly sardonic-looking angel, it's true, but one with the most magnificent wings. In my excitement, I never even stopped to wonder how the family would greet the arrival of a bird the size of a goose, with a beak like a razor. In case the man changed his mind, I hastily took off my clothes, beat as much of the dried mud off them as possible, and had a quick swim in the shallows. I put on my clothes again, whistled the dogs, and prepared to carry my prize home. The man untied the string, lifted the gull up, and handed him to me. I clasped it under one arm, surprised that such a huge bird should be so feather-light. I thanked the man profusely for his wonderful present. "He knows his name," he remarked, clasping the gull's beak between his fingers and wagging it gently. "I call him Aleko. He'll come when you call." Aleko, on hearing his name, paddled his feet wildly and looked up into my face with questioning yellow eyes. "You'll be wanting some fish for him," remarked the man. "I'm going out in the boat tomorrow about 8. If you like to come, we can catch a good lot for him." I said that would be fine, and Aleko gave a yarp of agreement. The man leant against the bows of the boat to push it out, and I suddenly remembered something. As casually as I could, I asked him what his name was and why he was in prison. He smiled charmingly over his shoulder. "My name's Kosti," he said. "Kosti Panopoulos. I killed my wife." He leant against the bows of the boat and heaved. She slid whispering across the sand and into the water, and the little ripples leapt and licked at her stern like excited puppies. Kosti scrambled into the boat and took up the oars. "Your health," he called. "Until tomorrow." The oars creaked musically, and the boat skimmed rapidly over the limpid waters. I turned, clasping my precious bird under my arm, and started to trudge back over the sand towards the Chessboard fields. The walk home took me some time. I decided that I had misjudged Aleko's weight, for he appeared to get heavier and heavier as we progressed. He was a dead weight that sagged lower and lower, until I was forced to jerk him up under my arm again, whereupon he would protest with a vigorous yarp. We were halfway through the fields when I saw a convenient fig tree which would, I thought, provide both shade and sustenance, so I decided to take a rest. While I lay in the long grass and munched figs, Aleko sat nearby, as still as though he were carved out of wood, watching the dogs with unblinking eyes. The only sign of life were his irises, which would expand and contract excitedly each time one of the dogs moved. Presently, rested and refreshed, I suggested to my band that we tackle the last stage of the journey. The dogs rose obediently, but Aleko fluffed out his feathers so that they rustled like dry leaves and shuddered all over at the thought. Apparently he disapproved of my hawking him around under my arm like an old sack ruffling his feathers. Now that he had persuaded me to put him down in such a pleasant spot, he had no intention of continuing what appeared to him to be a most tedious and unnecessary journey. As I stooped to pick him up, he snapped his beak, uttered a loud, harsh scream, and lifted his wings above his back in the posture usually adopted by tombstone angels. He glared at me. Why, his look seemed to imply, leave this spot? There was shade, soft grass to sit on, and water nearby. What point was there in leaving it to be humped about the countryside in a manner both uncomfortable and undignified? I pleaded with him for some time, and as he appeared to have calmed down, I made another attempt to pick him up. This time he left me in no doubt as to his desire to stay where he was. His beak shot out so fast I could not avoid it, and it hit my approaching hand accurately. It was as though I'd been slashed by an ice pick. My knuckles were bruised and aching, and a 2-inch gash welled blood in great profusion. Aleko looked so smug and satisfied with this attack that I lost my temper. Grabbing my butterfly net, I brought it down skillfully and, to his surprise, enveloped him in its folds. I jumped on him before he could recover from the shock and grabbed his beak in one hand. Then I wrapped my handkerchief round and round his beak and tied it securely in place with a bit of string, after which I took off my shirt and wrapped it around him so that his flailing wings were pinioned tightly to his body. He lay there, trussed up as though for market, glaring at me and uttering muffled screams of rage. Grimly, I picked up my equipment, put him under my arm, and stalked off towards home. Having got the gull, I wasn't going to stand any nonsense about getting him back to the villa. For the rest of the journey, Aleko proceeded to produce, uninterruptedly, a series of wild, strangled cries of piercing quality, so by the time we reached the house, I was thoroughly angry with him. I stamped into the drawing-room, put Aleko on the floor, and started to unwrap him while he accompanied the operation raucously. The noise brought Mother and Margot hurrying in from the kitchen. Aleko, now freed from my shirt, stood in the middle of the room with the handkerchief still tied round his beak and trumpeted furiously. "What on earth's that?" gasped Mother. "What an enormous bird!" exclaimed Margot. "What is it? An eagle?" My family's lack of ornithological knowledge had always been a source of annoyance to me. I explained testily that it was not an eagle, but a black-backed gull, and told them how I had got him. "But, dear, how on earth are we going to feed him?" asked Mother. "Does he eat fish?" "Aleko," I said hopefully, "would eat anything." I tried to catch him to remove the handkerchief from his beak, but he was obviously under the impression that I was trying to attack him, so he screamed and trumpeted loudly and ferociously through the handkerchief. This fresh outburst brought Larry and Leslie down from their rooms. "Who the hell's playing bagpipes?" demanded Larry as he swept in. Aleko paused for a moment, surveyed this newcomer coldly, and having summed him up, yarped loudly and scornfully. "My God!" said Larry, backing hastily and bumping into Leslie. "What the devil's that?" "It's a new bird Gerry's got," said Margot. "Doesn't it look fierce?" "It's a gull," said Leslie, peering over Larry's shoulder. "What a whacking great thing." "Nonsense," said Larry. "It's an albatross." "No, it's a gull." "Don't be silly. Whoever saw a gull that size? I tell you, it's a bloody great albatross." Aleko padded a few paces toward Larry and yarped at him again. "Call him off," Larry commanded. "Gerry, get the damn thing under control. It's attacking me." "Just stand still, he won't hurt you," advised Leslie. "It's all very well for you. You're behind me. Gerry, catch that bird at once before it does me irreparable damage." "Don't shout so, dear. You'll frighten it." "I like that. A thing like a rock flapping about on the floor attacking everyone, and you tell me not to frighten it." I managed to creep up behind Aleko and grab him. Then, amid his deafening protests, I removed the handkerchief from his beak. When I let him go again, he shuddered indignantly and snapped his beak 2 or 3 times with a sound like a whip crack. "Listen to it!" exclaimed Larry, "gnashing its teeth." "They haven't got teeth," observed Leslie. "Well, it's gnashing something. I hope you're not going to let him keep it, Mother. It's obviously a dangerous brute. Look at its eyes. Besides, it's unlucky." "Why unlucky?" asked Mother, who had a deep interest in superstition. "It's a well-known thing. Even if you have just the feathers in the house, everyone goes down with the plague or goes mad or something." "That's peacocks you're thinking of, dear." "No, I tell you, it's albatrosses. It's well known." "No, dear, it's peacocks that are unlucky." "Well, anyway, we can't have that thing in the house. It would be sheer lunacy. Look what happened to the Ancient Mariner. We'll all have to sleep with crossbows under our pillows." "Really, Larry, you do complicate things," said Mother. "It seems quite tame to me." "You wait until you wake up one morning and find you've had your eyes gouged out." "Oh, what nonsense you talk, dear. It looks quite harmless." At this moment, Dodo, who always took a little while to catch up with rapidly moving events, noticed Aleko for the first time. Breathing heavily, her eyes protruding with interest, she waddled forwards and sniffed at him. Aleko's beak flashed out, and if Dodo had not turned her head at that moment in response to my cry of alarm, her nose would have been neatly sliced off. As it was, she received a glancing blow on the side of the head that surprised her so much that her leg leapt out of joint. She threw back her head and let forth a piercing yell. Aleko, evidently under the impression that it was some sort of vocal contest, did his best to outscream Dodo and flapped his wings so vigorously that he blew out the nearest lamp. "There you are," said Larry in triumph. "What did I say? Hasn't been in the house 5 minutes, and it kills the dog." Mother and Margot massaged Dodo back into silence, and Aleko sat and watched the operation with interest. He clicked his beak sharply as if astonished at the frailty of the dog tribe, decorated the floor lavishly, and wagged his tail with the swagger of one who has done something clever. "How nice," said Larry. "Now we're expected to wade about the house waist-deep in guano." "Hadn't you better take him outside, dear?" suggested Mother. "Where are you going to keep him?" I said that I'd thought of dividing the magpie's cage and keeping Aleko there. Mother said this was a very good idea. Until his cage was ready, I tethered him on the veranda, warning each member of the family in turn as to his whereabouts. "Well," observed Larry as we sat down over dinner, "don't blame me if the house is hit by a cyclone. I've warned you. I can do no more." "Why a cyclone, dear?" "Albatrosses always bring bad weather with them." "It's the first time I've heard a cyclone described as bad weather," observed Leslie. "But it's peacocks that are unlucky, dear, I keep telling you," Mother said plaintively. "I know because an aunt of mine had some of the tail feathers in the house, and the cook died." "My dear Mother, the albatross is world famous as a bird of ill omen. Hardened old salts are known to go white and faint when they see one. I tell you, we'll find the chimney covered with St. Elmo's fire one night, and before we know where we are, we'll be drowned in our beds by a tidal wave." "You said it would be a cyclone," Margot pointed out. "A cyclone and a tidal wave," said Larry, "with probably a touch of earthquake and 1 or 2 volcanic eruptions thrown in. It's tempting Providence to keep that beast." "Where did you get him, anyway?" Leslie asked me. I explained about my meeting with Costi, omitting any mention of the water snakes, for all snakes were taboo with Leslie, and how he had given me the bird. "Nobody in their right senses would give somebody a present like that," observed Larry. "Who is this man, anyway?" Without thinking, I said he was a convict. "A convict?" quavered Mother. "What do you mean, a convict?" I explained about Costi being allowed home for the weekends because he was a trusted member of the Vido community. I added that he and I were going fishing the next morning. "I don't know whether it's very wise, dear," Mother said doubtfully. "I don't like the idea of your going about with a convict. You never know what he's done." Indignantly, I said I knew perfectly well what he'd done. He'd killed his wife. "A murderer?" said Mother, aghast. "But what's he doing wandering around the countryside? Why didn't they hang him?" "They don't have the death penalty here for anything except bandits," explained Leslie. "You get 3 years for murder and 5 years if you're caught dynamiting fish." "Ridiculous," said Mother indignantly. "I've never heard of anything so scandalous." "I think it shows a nice sense of the importance of things," said Larry. "White bait before women." "Anyway, I won't have you wandering around with a murderer," said Mother to me. "He might cut your throat or something." After an hour's arguing and pleading, I finally got Mother to agree that I should go fishing with Costi, providing that Leslie came down and had a look at him first. So the next morning I went fishing with Costi, and when we returned with enough food to keep Aleko occupied for a couple of days, I asked my friend to come up to the villa so that Mother could inspect him for herself. Mother had, after considerable mental effort, managed to commit to memory 2 or 3 Greek words. This lack of vocabulary had a restrictive effect on her conversation at the best of times, but when she was faced with the ordeal of exchanging small talk with a murderer, she promptly forgot all the Greek she knew. So she had to sit on the veranda, smiling nervously, while Costi, in his faded shirt and tattered pants, drank a glass of beer, and while I translated the conversation. "He seems such a nice man," Mother said when Costi had taken his leave. "He doesn't look a bit like a murderer." "What did you think a murderer looked like?" asked Larry. "Someone with a hare lip and a club foot, clutching a bottle marked poison in one hand?" "Oh, don't be silly, dear, of course not. But I thought he'd look, well, a little more murderous." "Well, you simply can't judge by physical appearance," Larry pointed out. "You can only tell by a person's actions. I could have told you he was a murderer at once." "How, dear?" asked Mother, very intrigued. "Elementary," said Larry with a deprecating sigh. "No one but a murderer would have thought of giving Gerry that albatross."